December 1944, the quiet Belgian town of Bastogne was never meant to become a battlefield. It was a road hub, nothing more. 7 narrow roads crossing frozen forests and empty fields. But when Adolf Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West, Bastogne suddenly became the key to everything. As German armored columns surged through the Ardennes, Allied lines collapsed with shocking speed. Units were overrun, communications severed, and panic spread. The weather turned brutal. Snow fell relentlessly, covering roads and forests in white, grounding Allied aircraft and blinding artillery observers. For the German High Command, it looked like the perfect moment to break the Western Allies in half. To stop them, the Americans had only one option: throw in the reserves. The 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers trained to jump behind enemy lines, were rushed forward by truck. Many had no winter clothing. Some carried summer boots. Ammunition was incomplete. Heavy weapons lagged behind. Within hours, they were ordered to defend Bastogne at all costs. By December 20th, the town was completely surrounded. German infantry and armor closed in from every direction. The forests echoed with artillery fire. Shells slammed into frozen ground, sending shards of ice and steel through the air. Houses burned. Roads disappeared under snow and wreckage. Medical supplies ran low. Wounded men froze as they waited for evacuation that never came. Inside the perimeter, the situation grew desperate. Food was rationed. Ammunition was counted shot by shot. Radios crackled with bad news. No relief was coming soon. The men of the 101st dug shallow foxholes into frozen earth, using helmets, bayonets, anything they could find. The cold was as dangerous as the enemy. Frostbite took fingers. Snow filled boots. Sleep came only in minutes. The Germans expected surrender. Instead, they met resistance. Every attack was answered with rifle fire, machine guns, and sudden counterattacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Paratroopers moved through the woods silently, striking and disappearing. German units reported unusually aggressive defense. Prisoners said the Americans were surrounded, starving, and still attacking. Bastogne had become a killing ground. What the Germans did not yet understand was that the men defending the town were not ordinary infantry. They were paratroopers trained to fight cut off, to survive without supply lines, and to hold ground even when logic said retreat. In the snow-choked forests around Bastogne, the battle was no longer about territory. It was about will, and the 101st Airborne had no intention of breaking. By December 22, 1944, the German High Command believed the situation at Bastogne was clear. The town was surrounded. American units inside were cut off from food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft. From a German perspective, resistance could not last much longer. So instead of attacking immediately, the Germans chose a cheaper option. Just after noon, under a white flag, a small German delegation approached American lines. 2 officers and a bugler moved cautiously through the snow-covered fields, escorted by nervous U.S. soldiers. In their hands was a formal message, carefully written and translated. It was addressed to the commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The message was polite but final. It demanded the immediate surrender of American forces. If the Americans refused, the letter warned, German artillery would annihilate the town. Civilian lives would be lost. Responsibility, the Germans stated, would rest entirely with the American commander. Inside Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was acting commander of the 101st Airborne. He had slept little for days. The situation was grim. Ammunition was low, wounded men crowded freezing aid stations, and the perimeter was under constant pressure. When McAuliffe read the German message, his first reaction was disbelief, then irritation. According to officers present, he exclaimed a single word in frustration, one that perfectly summarized his opinion of the demand: nuts. At first, his staff thought he was joking. Then they realized it was the most honest answer possible. When asked what reply should be sent to the Germans, McAuliffe didn't hesitate. "That's it," he said. "Send them that." The officers paused. "Sir, should we explain what it means?" McAuliffe smiled. "They'll figure it out." The official American response, delivered back to the German lines, read simply, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. The Germans were confused. Their officers stared at the message, unsure if it was a translation error or an insult. An American liaison officer finally explained that nuts was an expression meaning the demand was ridiculous and completely rejected. The effect was immediate. German commanders were stunned. They had expected negotiations, delay, perhaps a desperate plea for time. Instead, they received a one-word refusal dripping with confidence. Reports were sent up the chain of command, noting the unusually high morale of the encircled Americans. Inside Bastogne, the message spread like wildfire. Exhausted, freezing soldiers laughed for the first time in days. Nuts became a rallying cry, passed from foxhole to foxhole. It meant more than defiance. It meant the enemy had misjudged them completely. The Germans now understood something critical. The Americans were not waiting to surrender. They were waiting to fight. And in the frozen forests around Bastogne, that realization would cost Germany far more than words ever could. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne was not just another position on the map. It was the key to the entire German offensive in the Ardennes. 7 roads converged there, and if the town fell, German armor would surge west, splitting Allied forces and opening the road to Antwerp. The paratroopers understood this, even if no one had time to explain it in detail. By mid-December 1944, the 101st was surrounded, outgunned, and undersupplied. Many men had arrived without winter clothing. Ammunition was rationed shot by shot. Medics worked in freezing cellars with no anesthetics, using saws and morphine until both ran out. Snow filled foxholes faster than soldiers could dig them out. Yet the line held. The reason was not orders alone. It was identity. The 101st Airborne had been forged as an assault unit, trained to drop behind enemy lines and fight isolated. Encirclement was not a nightmare to them. It was expected. From Normandy to Holland, they had learned that survival depended on holding ground long enough for relief to arrive. Breaking was never part of the equation. German assaults came day and night. Infantry probed constantly. Artillery shattered tree lines into splintered explosions that rained wood and steel. Tanks appeared suddenly through fog and forest, their engines echoing like distant thunder. Each attack tested a different sector, searching for a crack. None appeared. Small groups of Americans fought independently, often without direct contact with headquarters. Squad leaders made decisions normally reserved for officers. When radios failed, runners crawled through snow and fire to pass messages. When ammunition ran low, soldiers collected weapons from the fallen, friend and enemy alike. Morale should have collapsed. Instead, it hardened. The Germans noticed it first. Prisoners reported that American positions refused to retreat even when isolated. Counterattacks were launched not to advance, but to regain a single foxhole or tree line. It made no tactical sense, except that it did. Every hour the 101st held Bastogne was an hour the German timetable slipped further out of reach. For the men in the line, the motivation was simpler. If they fell back, there was nowhere to go. Behind them were wounded comrades who could not be moved, medics who refused to abandon patients, and civilians hiding in basements. To break meant leaving them behind. That was unacceptable. So the order, spoken or unspoken, remained the same. Hold. Hold through the cold. Hold through the shelling. Hold until relief came, or until there was nothing left to hold with. The Germans expected collapse. What they found instead was a wall of frozen resolve. And at Bastogne, that resolve would decide the fate of an entire offensive. By the 4th day of fighting around Bastogne, Something had gone wrong in the German plan. The American lines were supposed to crack under pressure. Encircled units were meant to collapse quickly, cut off from fuel, ammunition, and medical support. That was how German doctrine expected surrounded enemies to behave. But the Americans inside Bastogne did not behave like a defeated force. German infantry units advancing through the frozen forests began to report something unsettling. Positions that should have been abandoned were still manned. Foxholes filled with snow still opened fire. Machine guns continued firing long after they should have gone silent. Even more disturbing, counterattacks. Small American groups struck suddenly from the woods, reclaiming ground that had already been taken. These attacks were not large or well supported. They were desperate, violent, and relentless. German soldiers described enemies who attacked without regard for losses, not to advance, but simply to deny terrain. Created confusion. German commanders struggled to assess American strength. Reconnaissance suggested the defenders were exhausted and undersupplied. Prisoners confirmed it. Yet every assault met stubborn resistance that did not weaken over time, it intensified. The psychological effect was profound. German infantry expected fear. Instead, they encountered silence, followed by gunfire. American soldiers rarely shouted or retreated. They waited. When German troops closed in, the defenders opened fire at point-blank range, often holding until the last possible second. Night was worse. In darkness and fog, German patrols moved cautiously, aware that American positions seemed to reappear where they had already been cleared. Trip flares snapped. Shots rang out. Isolated units reported being fired upon from behind, unsure how the Americans were moving through terrain they supposedly no longer controlled. Rumors spread quickly. Some German soldiers believed they were facing elite assault troops far stronger than intelligence reports claimed. Others whispered that the Americans were being reinforced at night, despite the encirclement. None of it was true, but fear does not need truth to grow. Captured German soldiers later admitted something more revealing. They feared the Americans not because they were aggressive, but because they refused to give up. A wounded American who continued fighting was more terrifying than a healthy enemy who retreated. Medics dragged casualties from the line under fire. Soldiers with frostbitten hands kept reloading weapons they could barely feel. Even when pushed back, American units regrouped and returned. There was no visible breaking point. For German officers, this resistance became a strategic problem. Timetables slipped. Ammunition was wasted on positions that should have fallen hours earlier. Assault units were exhausted fighting defenders who should have been finished. Bastogne was consuming strength the German offensive could not spare. What German soldiers faced was not superior numbers, nor superior weapons. It was an enemy that had accepted death and decided to fight anyway. And against that mindset, even a powerful army could hesitate. At Bastogne, German fear was not born from defeat. It was born from realization. The Americans were not going to die quietly. When the skies finally cleared over Bastogne, the battle had already been decided. For nearly a week, the 101st Airborne Division had held the crossroads under siege, without tanks, without winter clothing, and often without food or ammunition. What they had instead was time bought with blood. And that time changed the course of the Ardennes offensive. On December 23, 1944, the clouds broke. American transport planes appeared overhead, their engines echoing across the frozen fields. Parachutes blossomed in the sky, white, red, and green, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food. German soldiers watched helplessly as the siege they believed unbreakable began to unravel. Inside Bastogne, morale surged. The defenders who had fought for days on empty stomachs now knew they had not been forgotten. The sound of falling supply crates became a promise. Hold on a little longer. German attacks continued, but their momentum was gone. Repeated assaults against the American perimeter had failed to break the line. Each failed attack drained German infantry and armor needed elsewhere in the Ardennes. Bastogne was no longer just a road junction. It was an anchor dragging the entire offensive to a halt. On December 26th, American armor finally broke through. Tanks of the 4th Armored Division smashed into the southern edge of the town, ending the encirclement. The men of the 101st did not cheer wildly. They were too tired. They simply nodded, shook hands, and returned to their positions. The fight was not over, but the siege was. What happened at Bastogne quickly spread through both armies. For Americans, it became a symbol of resolve. A division surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing, yet unbroken. Newspapers would later call it a miracle. Soldiers simply called it doing their job. For Germans, Bastogne became a warning. Reports described defenders who refused surrender, commanders who answered demands with mockery, and units that fought without retreat even when logic demanded withdrawal. Bastogne was supposed to fall in hours. Instead, it became a graveyard for the German timetable. After the war, veterans struggled to explain what made Bastogne different. It was not heroics in the Hollywood sense. It was discipline, leadership, and an unspoken agreement among the men. No one leaves. The Screaming Eagles earned their legend not through conquest, but through endurance. Bastogne proved something lasting. Wars are not always decided by who advances fastest. Sometimes they are decided by who refuses to move at all. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, the Eagles held.